The birth of Prince Mustafa was celebrated across the Ottoman Empire. He was the long-awaited son of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent and Mahidevran Sultan, a child who symbolized strength, continuity, and an empire's future. From the very beginning, Mustafa showed signs of being the ideal heir, intelligent, charismatic, and deeply loved by both the people and the military. As he grew, his reputation only flourished. Unlike many royal heirs who lived in the shadow of their fathers, Mustafa stood out. He was not only a skilled warrior but also a just and compassionate leader. His time as a governor in Manisa and later in Amasya allowed him to prove his capabilities, gaining the loyalty of soldiers and officials alike. Even among his father's closest advisors, there were whispers that Mustafa would be a worthy successor, perhaps even greater than Suleiman himself. But the brilliance of Mustafa was also his greatest curse. His growing influence and popularity became a threat to those who had other ambitions for the throne. In the Ottoman court, where power was a dangerous game, enemies were never in short supply. Among them were those who sought to ensure that Mustafa never sat on the throne, no matter what it took. As the years passed, a dark cloud loomed over his future. The same empire that had once seen him as its destined ruler would soon become the stage for a tragedy that would shake its very foundation. The whispers of treachery, the weight of suspicion, and the manipulations of those closest to the Sultan would turn a father against his own son. And in the end, the fate of the perfect prince would be sealed, not by his enemies on the battlefield, but by the very man who had once cradled him as an infant. Despite his brilliance, Mustafa's greatest challenge was not an enemy on the battlefield but the silent forces working against him within the palace. The Ottoman court was a place where whispers could be deadlier than swords, and for Mustafa, these whispers would become his downfall. As Sultan Suleiman grew older, questions about his successor became more urgent. While Mustafa was the most obvious choice, his competence, popularity, and lineage making him the strongest candidate, there were others with different ambitions. Chief among them was Heir Sultan, Suleiman's beloved wife. As the first concubine to officially marry an Ottoman sultan, Heir had broken tradition, and she had no intention of stopping there. She wanted her own sons, particularly Selim, to have the throne. But with Mustafa in the way, that path seemed impossible. Heir was not alone in her pursuit. Her closest ally was Rustam Pasha, the Grand Vizier and husband of her daughter, Miriam Sultan. Rustam owed his position to Heir's influence, and he understood that securing the throne for Selim would solidify his own power. Together, they began weaving a narrative that Mustafa was not just ambitious but dangerous, an heir who would not wait for his father to die naturally but might seize the throne by force. The plan was subtle yet devastating. They planted seeds of doubt in Suleiman's mind, exploiting the Sultan's greatest fear, betrayal. They reminded him of history, of how sons had rebelled against their fathers, of how the empire had been torn apart by civil war when succession was unclear. Slowly, those closest to the Sultan fed him letters and reports claiming that Mustafa was gathering support from the Janissaries, the elite military force. Some letters even suggested that Mustafa was in secret contact with the Persian Shah, the empire's sworn enemy. At first, Suleiman dismissed the rumors. He had raised Mustafa himself, trained him in governance and war, and seen firsthand the qualities that made him a future ruler. But doubt, once planted, has a way of growing. The Sultan had ruled for decades, making difficult decisions that shaped the empire, but the thought of his own son turning against him struck a nerve. Had he grown too trusting? Was he allowing emotions to cloud his judgment? Rustam Pasha played his final move by arranging a test of Mustafa's loyalty. When Suleiman left for a military campaign, Mustafa was summoned to join him. It was a test of obedience, one that Mustafa, unaware of the trap being set, would walk straight into. The Sultan would soon face a choice that no father should ever have to make, and the empire would stand witness to a tragedy that would change history forever. As Sultan Suleiman sat in his imperial tent, the weight of his decision pressed upon him like never before. The air was thick with tension, the silence almost unbearable. Outside, the camp bustled with soldiers preparing for war, unaware that a battle of a different kind was unfolding within the Sultan's heart. He had summoned his son, Prince Mustafa, to meet him. What Mustafa did not know was that he was walking into his own death. The accusations against Mustafa had grown too numerous, too compelling for Suleiman to ignore. The Sultan had been presented with so-called evidence, letters, intercepted messages, and reports from spies suggesting that Mustafa had been plotting against him. Some claimed he was aligning with the powerful Janissaries, the elite military corps, and had even sent secret envoys to the Persian Shah. These accusations, whether true or fabricated, painted Mustafa as a prince no longer content to wait for his father's natural passing but one who might seize the throne by force. Mustafa, confident in his loyalty and his right to succeed, did not hesitate when called. He had no reason to fear his father, the man who had once looked upon him with pride. The Janissaries, devoted to him, cheered as he made his way toward the Sultan's tent. They believed their prince was destined to rule, that this meeting was just another step in his path to the throne. Mustafa himself may have thought the same. He entered the tent with the bearing of a future emperor, expecting a discussion, perhaps a test of his resolve. What he saw instead was not a welcoming father but a sultan who had already made up his mind. The moment he crossed the threshold, armed executioners sprang from the shadows. Realization struck in an instant. This was no meeting, no test. It was a sentence. Mustafa fought back, using his strength and skill, but he was outnumbered. The struggle was fierce, the executioners knowing that the prince would not go down easily. It took multiple men to subdue him, their cords tightening around his throat as he gasped for breath. He fought until his last moment, but fate had already been sealed. The news of Mustafa's execution spread like wildfire through the camp. The Janissaries, the people, even members of the court were in disbelief. Many had seen Mustafa as the rightful heir, the future of the empire. Now, he was gone, his body lifeless in the very place where he once stood with honor. Suleiman, the magnificent ruler of an empire that stretched across continents, had lost more than just a son that day. He had lost a part of himself. As he sat in solitude, staring at the empty space where his son should have stood, one question loomed over him, a question that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Had he done the right thing, or had he just committed the greatest mistake of his reign? The moment word spread that Prince Mustafa had been executed, shockwaves rippled through the Ottoman Empire. In the military camp, the Janissaries, fiercely loyal to Mustafa, were the first to react. Just hours earlier, they had cheered for their prince as he walked toward his father's tent, believing him to be the future of the empire. Now, they stood in stunned silence, unable to grasp that he was gone. Some refused to believe it at first, thinking it was a cruel rumor. But when his lifeless body was carried out, their silence turned into an uproar. Murmurs became shouts, and soon, anger flared among the soldiers. Some wept openly, others clenched their fists, vowing that this injustice would not be forgotten. Many had fought under Mustafa's command and had seen in him a strong, capable leader who embodied everything an Ottoman sultan should be. To them, his execution was not just the loss of a prince, it was the loss of the empire's future. A dark cloud of resentment settled over the army. Though they dared not rise against Sultan Suleiman, their faith in him had been shaken. In the capital, the reaction was no less intense. News traveled fast, reaching Istanbul before Suleiman himself returned. The people, who had admired Mustafa's leadership and charm, were heartbroken. He had been their hope, a prince who had the makings of a just and wise ruler. Now, he was dead at the hands of his own father. The grief turned into whispers of conspiracy. Some blamed the Sultan's advisors, especially Grand Vizier Rustam Pasha and Harem Sultan, who were long suspected of plotting against Mustafa. Others questioned whether the Sultan had been deceived into believing lies about his son. Mustafa's mother, Mahidevran Sultan, was devastated beyond words. She had fought for years to protect her son from court intrigues, knowing that the favor of the Sultan was never guaranteed. When she learned of his death, it was as if her world had ended. She had lost not only her son but also her place in the palace. With no powerful allies left, she was forced into a quiet, grief-stricken exile, her life reduced to mourning the son who had been taken from her. Even within the royal court, there was unease. Some advisors feared that the Sultan had gone too far. Others wondered if this was the beginning of instability in the empire. Without Mustafa, the line of succession was left uncertain. His younger half-brothers, Selim and Bayezid, were now the contenders for the throne, but neither had Mustafa's charisma or military prowess. Despite the sorrow and unrest, there was no rebellion. The Sultan's authority was absolute. No one could openly challenge his decision, but the impact of Mustafa's execution would be felt for years to come. The empire had lost a prince, and with him, it had lost the certainty of a strong and secure future. The people mourned, the army grieved, and even within the walls of Topkapi Palace, an uneasy silence lingered. The Sultan had won the battle against his son, but in doing so, he had created a wound in the heart of the empire, one that would never fully heal. The execution of Prince Mustafa was not just the loss of a son, it was the loss of the strongest heir to the Ottoman throne. His death altered the course of history, leaving behind an empire that would never be the same. With his removal, the Ottoman succession took a dangerous turn, leading to internal conflicts, instability, and, ultimately, the weakening of the empire itself. Mustafa had been the most capable and admired of all of Suleiman's sons. His military victories, leadership skills, and deep connection with the Janissaries made him the natural successor. Had he lived, the transition of power from Suleiman to Mustafa might have been smooth, ensuring continued stability and strong military leadership. But with his death, that stability was shattered. The question of succession now lay between his two surviving half-brothers, Selim and Bayezid, neither of whom matched Mustafa's strength. Tensions between Selim and Bayezid escalated in the years after Mustafa's execution. Both saw themselves as the rightful heir, but the empire could not have two sultans. Their rivalry soon turned into open conflict, leading to a brutal civil war. In the end, Selim emerged victorious, but not because of his strength. He won with the backing of his father, while Bayezid was forced into exile and later executed. Unlike Mustafa, who had been loved by the military and the people, Selim was seen as weak, indulgent, and unfit to rule. When Suleiman passed away, Selim became Sultan Selim II, marking a shift in the empire's direction. Unlike his father, he was not a warrior or a statesman, he was a ruler who preferred luxury over leadership. His reign saw the beginning of what many historians consider the slow decline of the Ottoman Empire. Corruption increased, the Janissaries grew more uncontrollable, and the strong military leadership that had defined the empire began to fade. The Ottoman throne, once held by fierce warriors and strategists, was now in the hands of a ruler who relied more on his advisors than his own capabilities. The execution of Mustafa also deeply affected Suleiman himself. Though he never publicly admitted regret, those close to him noticed a change. The once glorious sultan, who had expanded the empire to its greatest heights, became more withdrawn, spending his final years in solitude. Some say that he began to question whether he had been deceived, whether the accusations against Mustafa had been exaggerated by those who sought their own power. But by then, it was too late. His decision had already set the empire on a path that could not be reversed. Had Mustafa lived and ruled after Suleiman, history might have been different. The Ottomans could have remained a dominant force for centuries, avoiding the internal conflicts that weakened them. But with his death, the fate of the empire was sealed. The golden age of the Ottomans had reached its peak, and the slow decline had begun. One decision, one execution, had changed the course of history forever. The death of Prince Mustafa was not just a moment of personal loss for Sultan Suleiman, it was the turning point that cast a shadow over the empire's future. A prince destined to rule, a father forced to choose duty over blood, and a court filled with whispers of betrayal. This was the tragedy that would haunt the Ottoman dynasty for generations. Mustafa had been everything an empire could ask for: brave, intelligent, and beloved by the people. His execution was not merely the fall of a prince but the death of an era where strength and merit determined succession. His father, once the mightiest ruler in the world, spent his final years in isolation, carrying the weight of a decision that could never be undone. The empire, too, felt the consequences. The Sultanate had lost its strongest heir, and what followed was a period of internal strife and weak leadership. Selim too, the son who ultimately inherited the throne, lacked Mustafa's strength and vision. The decline of the Ottoman Empire did not happen overnight, but historians often trace its beginnings back to the moment when a father ordered the death of his most capable son. Did Suleiman regret his choice? Some sources suggest that in his later years, the once mighty ruler was consumed by grief, often visiting Mustafa's grave in secret. Others believe that he accepted it as the price of ruling an empire. But the truth remains buried with him. Mustafa's story is one of promise, betrayal, and fate, a reminder that even the greatest of rulers are not immune to the weight of their own decisions. His execution was not just the fall of a son but the moment an empire lost its brightest future. And in the silence that followed, one question remained: had he lived, would the Ottoman Empire have changed forever?